Have you ever had a night where no matter how hard you tried, sleep simply wouldn't come? The hours crawl by, the clock ticks louder than usual, and your thoughts seem to multiply in the silence. It's a strange, uncomfortable place to be restless, still, and yet full of motion inside your mind. But sometimes those nights hold more meaning than we think. A sleepless night doesn't always have to be a curse. Sometimes it becomes a quiet space where deeper understanding begins to unfold. It's easy to think that not sleeping is just a problem to be solved, something to fix with a glass of warm milk or by counting sheep. But when you really look at what happens in those hours, you begin to notice something else. You hear your own thoughts more clearly. You begin to ask yourself questions you usually avoid during the day. Why do I feel uneasy? What is bothering me? What am I afraid of? It's in those slow, silent hours that the mind begins to speak truths that get buried under noise, under routine, under distraction. That's exactly what this story offers, a gentle reminder that restlessness isn't always about insomnia. It's sometimes about unresolved thoughts, unspoken emotions, and things left unsaid. Through the quietness of a sleepless night, you're given a rare opportunity to confront these things not with panic, but with patience. In those moments, you begin to discover parts of yourself that were easy to ignore when the world was loud and busy. It's not just the body that can't rest, it's the heart, the mind, the soul asking to be heard. When you listen to a story like this through English dialogue, you're not just improving your language skills. You're stepping into someone else's stillness. You begin to feel what they feel. The hesitations, the pauses in the speech, the unspoken meaning behind certain words, these are the subtle tools that show emotion in language. You understand that sometimes even a simple phrase like "I don't know what's wrong" can carry 100 layers of meaning underneath. And suddenly, the story stops being just about sleeplessness. It becomes a bridge to empathy. That's the beauty of learning English through storytelling. It doesn't separate vocabulary from emotion. It doesn't teach you lists of words you'll never use. Instead, it gives you those words in their natural habitats, spoken by someone who feels real, in a moment that could happen to anyone. When you hear someone struggle to fall asleep and slowly open up, you don't just learn how to say tired or anxious. You learn how to hear it, how to sense it in a voice, how to respond to it with kindness. That's language at its most human level. In that sense, the night becomes a teacher too. It teaches you not just new words, but new ways of seeing. You begin to understand that discomfort isn't always negative, it can be a guide. That silence doesn't always mean nothing, it can mean everything. And most importantly, that stories, even simple ones, can be mirrors. You may start by listening to improve your English, but you walk away having improved something else. Your understanding of people, of feelings, of the kind of connection that words can build. So while the night may feel long and the mind may feel noisy, there is a lesson tucked away in that stillness. Sometimes it's only in sleepless moments that we hear what we really need to know, and that's where learning, real learning, truly begins. When we think about learning a new language, the first things that often come to mind are grammar rules, vocabulary lists, maybe even complicated sentence structures. But if we stop and reflect for a moment, we realize that most of the language we use in our everyday lives doesn't come from textbooks. It comes from conversation, from the way people speak to each other in real moments, especially when emotions are involved. That's where real English lives, not in the pages of a dictionary, but in the rhythm and tone of natural dialogue. Natural dialogue is where the heart of language beats. It's messy, unpredictable, full of pauses, feelings, interruptions, and small details that make it human. It's in those raw, unfiltered exchanges that we find the phrases and expressions people actually use when they're sad, confused, nervous, or trying to be brave. And that's what makes a story like this so valuable for English learners. It doesn't just show you how the language looks, it shows you how the language feels. When you listen to two characters speaking in a story like this, especially during a vulnerable moment, like someone struggling to sleep or trying to express what's going on in their mind, you begin to absorb more than just vocabulary. You begin to notice how tone changes with mood, how simple words take on deeper meaning depending on the context. A phrase like "I'm fine" might seem straightforward, but when said in a soft, uncertain voice, it suddenly feels like a lie someone is telling to protect themselves. That's not something a textbook can teach you. That's something you feel through dialogue. In this particular story, those conversations aren't formal. They're not rehearsed. They're real, relaxed, full of hesitation, repetition, even silence. And yet they carry so much. You don't just hear English. You hear how English works in the world of real people. You learn that sometimes comfort isn't in saying something clever, it's in saying something true. Even if it's simple, especially if it's simple, and that's the point. Natural dialogue gives you access to phrases you'll actually use. Things like "you've been quiet lately," or "do you want to talk about it?" These are the kinds of sentences that happen in real life, every day, between friends, family members, people who care about each other. These are the moments where English becomes not just a language, but a connection. Stories like this don't just help you understand English. They help you feel it. They prepare you for the kind of conversations that don't follow rules, that don't go as planned, that depend more on emotion than on grammar. That's what makes learning through dialogue so powerful. You start to recognize not just what people are saying, but what they're trying to say. And once you understand that, you begin to use the language with more confidence, more sensitivity, and more purpose. And here's something else. When you hear these phrases in a story, you remember them better. Why? Because they come with feelings. Our brains remember feelings more than facts. If a phrase is said during a sad or moving part of a story, you're more likely to recall it. It sticks. It means something. You're not just memorizing. You're relating, and that's what learning should feel like. So if you're trying to learn English and you're tired of memorizing grammar charts and isolated vocabulary lists, give yourself permission to listen. Really listen. Let the conversation wash over you. Hear the way people pause before saying something difficult. Hear how a voice softens when someone is trying to comfort someone else. Let yourself become part of that moment, even if you're just a listener. Because that's where fluency begins, not in perfection, but in understanding. And when you understand, you start to speak, not just correctly, but sincerely. There's a delicate balance in learning, especially when it comes to language. On one hand, you want to be challenged, to stretch your understanding and grow. But on the other, you don't want to feel lost or overwhelmed. That's why Level 4 content is so important for learners who are no longer beginners, but still need guidance and structure. It offers that perfect middle ground where the language feels rich and layered, yet the story stays clear, engaging, and within reach. In a story like this, the challenge doesn't come from complicated academic words or long, dense paragraphs. It comes from how the language is used in natural, meaningful ways. You're exposed to real expressions, emotional language, and conversational grammar, all wrapped in a story that pulls you in. You're not just listening to learn. You're listening because you want to know what happens next. That's when learning becomes effortless. It doesn't feel like studying anymore. It feels like being part of something. The pacing of Level 4 stories is also key. They don't rush you. The dialogue gives you time to catch the flow, to hear the words in context, to reflect on what's being said and why. At the same time, they avoid being too slow or repetitive. They push your comprehension gently forward, giving you enough to grasp but still enough to challenge. You find yourself thinking, wait, what does that phrase mean? But you don't stop. You keep going, and somehow you understand it by the end. That's the kind of challenge that builds confidence, and the topics chosen for this level are just as important. They go beyond basic conversations like ordering food or introducing yourself. You're now stepping into emotional territory, stories about worry, confusion, sleeplessness, or even joy and comfort. These aren't textbook exercises. They're human moments, and understanding these moments through language teaches more than vocabulary. It teaches empathy, timing, tone. You begin to see how English carries weight, not just in what is said, but in how it's said. What's also beautiful about Level 4 stories is how they remain accessible. Even when the content becomes emotionally deep or linguistically rich, it doesn't alienate the listener. It doesn't assume too much. It still uses sentence structures and vocabulary that are familiar enough for learners to follow, yet complex enough to help them grow. There's no intimidation, just invitation. An invitation to step a little further into the language, to test your ears, to trust your instincts, and to realize that you understand more than you think. Sometimes you only notice how far you've come when you're in the middle of something that would have felt impossible just weeks ago. You listen to a scene unfold between two characters, one sharing something quietly, the other listening, and suddenly you understand the tension, the emotion, the subtext, not because someone translated it for you, but because your brain, little by little, picked up the patterns. That's what Level 4 does. It doesn't hand you the answers. It helps you discover them, and that sense of discovery, that realization that you're not just learning English, but living it through the story, is powerful. It's motivating. It keeps you coming back, eager for the next sentence, the next moment, the next chance to understand. And isn't that the best kind of learning? The kind where you forget you're being taught because the content is so engaging, and yet you walk away stronger, sharper, and more connected to the language than before. That's the quiet strength of Level 4 content. It respects the learner. It recognizes that you're ready to be challenged, but you still deserve stories that speak to you, not at you, stories that stay with you long after the final word is spoken. One of the most frustrating parts of learning a language is forgetting new words right after learning them. You write them down, maybe repeat them a few times, but when it's time to actually use them in conversation, your mind goes completely blank. That's because words by themselves are hard to hold on to. They don't mean much in isolation, but something changes when those words are placed inside a story, inside a real moment between people. Suddenly, the word isn't just a word, it's part of a feeling, a situation, a memory. And that's when it starts to stick. That's the quiet magic of vocabulary being woven into context. You're not just told, here's a new word, memorize it. Instead, you hear it come up naturally as part of a conversation. Maybe a character is feeling restless and says, I just can't settle down tonight. You don't stop and think, what's settle down? You hear it in a moment of emotional truth. You understand it through tone, body language, and the flow of the dialogue. That understanding happens almost automatically without you needing to analyze it word by word. When vocabulary is introduced this way, through meaningful situations, it becomes personal. You connect it to the characters, to the emotion, to the problem they're facing. And because you care about what's happening in the story, your brain naturally remembers the language used to tell it. That's very different from memorizing a list. Lists don't move you, stories do. This kind of learning is deep, not shallow. When you hear the same word repeated in different ways, first in a question, then in a response, then maybe in a moment of reflection, it becomes more than just a definition. You start to notice its flexibility. You see how tone changes its meaning. You understand what kind of situations it belongs in. And most importantly, you gain the confidence to use it yourself, not because you memorized it, but because you've heard it live, breathing inside a real conversation. The beauty of this approach is that it mirrors how native speakers learn. No one grows up learning language from vocabulary cards. We learn it by hearing people around us talk, during arguments, during jokes, during quiet conversations late at night. We absorb the meaning of words through repetition, emotion, and context. And the more we see those words used in real moments, the more naturally we begin to use them ourselves. That's what this story offers, a chance to learn the way we were meant to learn, by listening, feeling, and understanding. And there's something very empowering about realizing you understand a new word without needing a translation. Maybe it's said in a soft voice and the moment feels heavy. You don't know the exact definition at first, but something inside you just gets it. That's not just learning, that's intuition being built step by step through exposure. Through context, it also helps that stories like this repeat key words in slightly different forms. Maybe someone says, "I'm exhausted," and later another person says he looks drained. They don't explain that drained means very tired. They just let you hear it, and you, as a listener, start to draw the connection. You begin to notice patterns, and those patterns are what build fluency. Not just the ability to understand, but the ability to use language naturally with confidence. So the next time you hear a new word in a story, try not to stop the video or reach for a dictionary right away. Let it land, let it live in the moment. Ask yourself what's happening in the scene, how the character feels, what they're trying to express. Let the meaning rise out of the context, like light slowly filling a room. Because when you learn like that, you're not just remembering, you're becoming part of the language. Stories like this one don't just teach language, they teach life. And one of the most important lessons that comes through is about empathy. It's something that doesn't always get enough attention in language learning, but it's essential. When someone speaks, they're not just using grammar and vocabulary, they're sharing a piece of themselves. And understanding that, truly hearing what's underneath the words, is what empathy is all about. In this story, you can feel it from the very beginning. There's a sense of concern in the way one character listens, in the tone of the questions being asked. It's not rushed. It's not scripted. It feels like someone genuinely cares. And as a listener, you're not just following the conversation. You're learning how to be present with someone else's feelings. That's powerful because empathy isn't just something you show. It's something you speak. It's in the choice of words, in the pauses, in saying things like, "I'm here if you want to talk," or "that sounds really difficult." These are simple phrases, but they carry weight. And the more we hear them, the more we understand how to use English not just for information, but for connection. Then there's the role of routine. It might seem like a small detail in the story. Maybe someone talking about not being able to sleep at the same time they usually do, or missing a part of their normal schedule. But those small changes tell us something important. Routines give us stability. They give us a sense of control in a world that often feels unpredictable. And when that routine is disrupted, it's not just a matter of time. It becomes emotional. That's something learners can relate to deeply, especially when they're adapting to new environments or dealing with changes in their lives. When English is used to talk about routine, it becomes a way of grounding yourself. Phrases like "I usually wake up at 7" or "I missed my evening walk" seem ordinary on the surface, but in a story they become windows into someone's emotional state. You start to see how small changes in routine can reflect bigger changes inside someone's heart. And suddenly you realize that talking about daily life in English isn't boring. It's meaningful. It tells a story all on its own. And finally, there's the importance of expressing emotion. It's one of the most difficult things to do in another language, not just because of vocabulary, but because it makes you vulnerable. Saying "I'm tired" is easy. Saying "I'm scared" or "I feel alone" or "I don't know what's wrong with me," those are harder. But when you hear those emotions expressed in a story, when you see them modeled in a way that feels natural and safe, it becomes easier. You begin to think, "I could say that too." This story shows us that expressing emotions in English isn't about being dramatic. It's about being honest. It's about finding the right words to describe what's going on inside and trusting that someone else will hear you. Whether it's through phrases like "I can't sleep because my thoughts won't stop," or "I just feel heavy today." You're learning more than language. You're learning to open up. And in doing that, you're not just becoming a better speaker. You're becoming a more thoughtful communicator. These are the kinds of lessons that stick. Not because someone explained them in a classroom, but because you felt them in a moment, in a story, in a voice that sounded like it needed to be heard. And the more we practice empathy, value routine, and express emotion in English, the more fluent we become, not just in language, but in life. When learning a new language, it can sometimes feel like you have to split everything into separate boxes. One moment you're working on listening, the next you're drilling vocabulary, and after that, you're practicing conversation skills. But real language doesn't live in boxes, it flows. It moves between sounds, words, and meanings all at once. That's why an immersive story like this one is such a powerful learning tool. It allows you to practice listening, build vocabulary, and absorb conversational patterns altogether, naturally and without pressure. As soon as the story begins, you're not just hearing English. You're hearing real emotion, real rhythm, real speech. You're listening to how people actually talk, not how textbooks think they talk. That makes a big difference. The sounds aren't always perfect. There are hesitations, changes in tone, soft endings, but that's exactly the point. You're training your ear to pick up language in its living, breathing form. You begin to notice things that are often invisible in written English, like how intonation rises when someone asks a question, or how certain words are softened when someone feels uncertain. And because you're listening to the language unfold in real time, your brain starts working differently. You're not just translating anymore, you're understanding, you're following the flow. You're picking up cues not just from the words, but from the pauses, the silences, and the way one speaker responds to another. That kind of listening is a skill that only grows through exposure, and stories are the perfect environment for that exposure to feel meaningful. At the same time, you're constantly being introduced to new vocabulary, but in a way that's organic, not forced. You hear a character say, "I feel drained," and even if you don't know that word at first, the context helps you figure it out. Later in the story, maybe another word like exhausted or restless appears, and you start to see connections. These aren't just words on a list. They're emotions being lived. You feel them through the situation, and that's what helps them stick in your memory. And the more you listen, the more familiar these words become. Not just in meaning, but in how they sound, how they're used in different types of sentences, and how they can shift depending on who's speaking and what they're feeling. That's the kind of vocabulary growth that feels effortless. It doesn't come from memorizing. It comes from understanding through experience, and every story offers dozens of chances for that kind of experience. Along with listening and vocabulary, another layer forms: your awareness of conversational patterns. These are the subtle things that make conversations feel real. The way someone opens a topic, the way they respond with care or curiosity, how they ask a follow-up question, or how they show they're listening. In this story, for example, you hear soft, careful exchanges. You hear concern expressed not with complicated language, but with sincerity. Are you okay? Want to talk about it? That sounds tough. These are simple patterns, but they're powerful. They show how natural English feels when it's grounded in real human moments. As a listener, you start to absorb these patterns without even realizing it. You start to feel more comfortable with what to say and how to say it. You begin to know when to speak and when to pause. You notice how connection is built through rhythm, not just words. And slowly, your own spoken English starts to shift. It becomes less stiff, more alive, more confident. That's what happens when listening, vocabulary, and conversation practice all come together in one immersive tale. The story pulls you in, not just with language, but with feeling. And while you're following that emotional journey, your mind is doing the deeper work, training your ears, building your word bank, and shaping your ability to communicate with grace and understanding. Thank you for joining this journey through story, where every word, every pause, and every emotion brought English to life. With each tale, you're not just learning the language, you're living it. Keep listening, keep feeling, and let every story carry you one step closer to fluency.